Okay, hello, Michael Tracy here with Ronan Burtonshaw. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yep,
Okay, very
absolutely.
good. Who is has an affiliation with Jacobin magazine as the Europe editor, and I wanted to get his thoughts on the tumult currently on display in France. It's probably one of the most dramatic presidential elections in recent memory. So you were just telling me that uh, Melanchon, the left wing candidate who has surged in recent weeks, is holding hologram
Yes.
campaign events. Can you just explain what that entails?
So tonight, Melanchon is holding 7 meetings simultaneously in different parts of France by using a hologram. This is a technique that he developed early on in the campaign, in what has been a pretty innovative campaign, one that had its own video game, that has a huge social media presence, that actually had a lot of its early work done in a quite participatory way and through YouTube. So, for instance, when they launched their economic program, it was done live on YouTube with invited economists, both his own and then economists who are critical. And there was a facility for people to question back and forth and to engage in it from the audience as well. Something that has happened quite a lot with his new movement, which is called France Insoumise, or Rebellious France, that he launched for this election campaign.
Now, I mean, as far as you can discern, do people look at the hologram tactic in sort of a cheeky manner? Is there like a hint of irony in the way that they are processing it? What is the reaction to that tactic?
Actually, people responded to it pretty well. I think this is an attempt by Mélenchon to overcome the idea of the left in France as being something of the past. Right? So for a long time, because France has got this long-standing radical left tradition, had a big communist party. The communists, for instance, and the socialists were together in a government at the start of the 1980s, and it has a deep history of the left, but most of it is really understood as history. These parties had declined in recent years. The level of social weight that they had was much smaller than it would have been in previous decades. And there was a need felt by the Melanchon campaign to give the sense that the left was doing something new, dynamic. This was why they changed their rhetoric, how they were talking about politics, from one that was traditionally left versus right, based on class and so on, to one that was more populist. So it still had class undertones, but it was about the oligarchy versus the people. It was about a project to build a sixth republic, so to refound French society, to kind of create a democratic revolution, if you want, in France, which would not just be some question of left versus right, but would be a political project of trying to re-empower citizens in France as against their elite. So this is part of a general kind of strategy of the Mélenchon campaign, which has been quite successful. So in 2012, in the last presidential election, he stood with the Left Front, which was an amalgamation of various socialist parties. And he really struggled to break through, partly because the platform he stood on had to be agreed between numerous different parties and forces. There was the messaging of the campaign was not as strong, and he really did struggle to break through the idea of the traditional left being something that people didn't consider to be dealing with the problems that they were now facing. They were thinking of the left front more as something to be nostalgic about from the time when it fought so hard to build a welfare state in France, rather than something that was now kind of a challenge to the establishment. So they've been quite successful with that. I mean, the numbers are now that, as we stand in the polls, the top two candidates usually are Le Pen and Macron. But for most of this campaign up to the last few weeks, Marine Le Pen, the candidate of the radical right, Emmanuel Macron, the candidate of the centre, were quite a long way ahead of the others, and with Francois Fillon, the candidate of the centre-right, being in behind. Now what we've got is 4 candidates within basically the margin of error in most polls at the top. So Macron and Le Pen still usually come out ahead, but 1 or 2 points behind often now is Melanchon and Fillon, who's the candidate of the centre-right.
Right, and as it stands now, I mean, 4 candidates appear to be basically within the margin of error. So that means the result is basically anyone's guess at this point, which is an extreme oddity for French politics, because as many analysts have commented, typically the outcome in presidential elections and runoffs and so forth have been relatively preordained, or at least the outcome wasn't so in flux.
Yes.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that Melanchon has sort of run a populist campaign more than one that is, really identified as orthodox left wing. So I'm wondering if that sort of message could conceivably resonate with maybe people who are on the lower rung of the economic ladder, but don't have, say, left wing cultural values. Maybe people who would be inclined to back Le Pen, or at least that would be the popular expectation. I mean, does that message lend itself to a wider breadth, potentially receptive voters, as far as you can gather?
Well, one of the things, so there was a big debate here in the early stages of the Melanchon campaign about whether or not they should find common ground and a common campaign with another left-wing candidate, a centre-left candidate who has now fallen way back behind in the polls, Benoit Hamon, who was the candidate of the Socialist Party, which was governing France. And he actually won a primary, a bit like Jeremy Corbyn in Britain, on the left. And a kind of anti-establishment primary within his party. But the Melanchon campaign said no, they backed away from such a deal. And the reason they did it is because they argued this was not a campaign about winning the left. It was a campaign about winning people who are disgusted with French politics. So people who felt disenfranchised, who are not identifying with any party, who didn't consider themselves left or right because they thought left or right were terms within politics that was excluding them. And so the orientation is towards getting people who are not affiliated with any of the parties, don't consider themselves to have those kind of views of society, to mobilize and vote for Melanchon. And the word that they use is the disgusted, which means that his campaign is putting an awful lot of stead into high turnout. Really the question on election day, if you're looking to see early on, are things going the way of Melanchon, are they not? The higher the turnout, the more likely it is that his campaign, which is aimed at people who are not voting or not affiliated to any of the parties, the higher the turnout is, the better that they will be doing. But the question of the vote transfer with the Front National is interesting. Actually, the evidence of this, there was some recent polling which showed that there is quite a significant portion of Marine Le Pen's vote which is sympathetic to Melanchon. So a poll out just a few days ago showed that 26% of Marine Le Pen's voters, the Front National, the radical right, have the second preference as Melanchon. By contrast, Melanchon's voters, only 4% of them would vote for the Front National as their second preference. So I think we probably are seeing some drift of Le Pen voters. Le Pen, of course, at one time was looking around 30% in the polls, is now in the low 20s. So part of her vote has departed, and I think probably some of that is behind the Melanchon wave. But most of it is actually traditional Socialist Party, centre-left people who are infuriated by the Hollande government, its embrace of austerity, who felt abandoned by the kind of politics it practiced, and we're looking for something more anti-establishment on the left that was going to challenge the economic order in a way that the Hollande government refused to.
Yeah. There was an interesting tweet thread, I don't know if you happened to see it last week, by Angelique Christophis, who is a Guardian correspondent in Paris. And she basically relayed her findings in going to the French countryside and more rural areas and attempting to survey voter sentiment there. And she seemed to conclude that anti-EU sentiment was probably running higher than the pollsters even yet are being able to pick up on, and that was manifest in in support for both Le Pen and Melanchon. So one way that I've heard Melanchon attacked, even in the American press now, which is beginning to follow this race a little more closely, is that he and Le Pen sort of have a eerily similar program in that they could both roughly be characterized as Eurosceptic. Maybe that presents in different ways. But Melanchon has said that he would be open to the prospect of even of a Frexit referendum, and that's the signature issue, it would seem, or one of them for Le Pen. What is the dynamic in France domestically in terms of trying to tie those two to each other?
Yeah, well, there is an attempt to do so. I think it's worth having a comparison of the programs. So the Front National, Marine Le Pen's party, yes, they are critical of the European Union from a particular direction, which is that they're critical of it because of the narrative they build around mass migration, because they see it as a globalizing institution, this kind of globalization discourse that you get with Trump in the US as well. They see it as bad for French business and French industry, and because they're the nationalists. Melanchon builds a campaign around the European Union which argues this is the institution that crushed the Syriza government in Greece. This is the institution with the Troika that imposed austerity in Ireland, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy. This is the institution that has rules that mandate free movement of capital, free trade all the way across Europe, which means it's very hard to protect industries as the left would have tried to do in the past. It has a euro currency which the ECB can only consider inflation. It's not even like the Federal Reserve. So our central bank in Europe is more right-wing than the Federal Reserve in the US, which at least has a mandate to consider unemployment with its monetary policy. So there's huge range of left-wing criticisms to be made of the European Union. And I think people who try to just talk about criticizing the European Union as if all critiques come from the same position, that it's either the good progressive EU and the nasty nationalists on the outside, are missing an awful lot in that narrative. The other thing worth doing is looking at straightforwardly what their programs are. So the Front National, domestically in France, its focus is on migration. It talks about limiting the number of migrants coming into the country down to about 10,000 per year. To put in context, this is a country of 66 million. So we're basically talking about, ending migration into France. It talks about putting taxes on foreign nationals being employed by French companies, making deportations easier. It has a narrative about Islam, which is one of the things that it has built a very kind of strong position on. It talks about stripping citizenship from people with radical Islamic beliefs. It talks about shutting down mosques and organizations that promote those. But at the same time, it has this very comfortable ambiguity. So it talks about critiquing in general terms the Quran and Islam as a religion 1 minute, and then the next minute it's radical Islam. And so where exactly it intends to draw the line on what is radical and what is not clear, because Le Pen has made clear she doesn't believe that Islam is compatible with French culture, despite the fact that it's a very long-standing Muslim population in France. By contrast to this, Mélenchon's proposals in terms of migration and social issues will be considered on the left. He's a Republican who makes cases for civic equality, who makes cases for separating the church and the state, but not for pursuing campaigns that target specifically Muslims or Islam or any ethnic minority in the country. His economic program talks about 173 billion being spent, which is obviously quite a lot. Money going, 50 billion of that investment in green energy, making France totally both carbon neutral and free of nuclear energy. Having another 50 billion spent on the social crisis, building social housing, dealing with poverty, with anti-poverty programs, raising the minimum wage 15%. And then also funding an expansion of state involvement in the economy. And getting to this point by increasing taxation on the wealthiest in society and so on. While the Front National has moved to the left, there's no question about this on the economy. It's an interesting one. Back under its previous leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen, they were a Thatcherite party. This was somebody in the 80s as an anti-establishment figure. That kind of Reagan-Thatcher politics was an anti-establishment right-wing politics at that time of a kind. But now, touting free market economics is going to get you nowhere with the constituency that Front National aims for. And so they have moved in particular ways, one to lower the retirement age, protecting the length of the work week, defending welfare and so on, in a particular identitarian way for, basically for white French people. But still, those are proposals which, social democratic parties could have made in the past. At the same time, they try to have their cake and eat it. So they're not talking about funding these things by going after the rich. They're talking about defending French business, cutting red tape, a kind of pro-business narrative alongside this. So they're trying to step on both feet. But I think there is clear, blue water between Melanchon and Le Pen on social issues, also the economy in terms of Melanchon's willingness to really go after the wealthiest in society, and versus Le Pen's emphasis on security, migration, the culture war, and so on. And so their discourses are really quite different.
I think there was an exchange that seemed to get a fair amount of attention in one of the televised debates or forums between Melanchon and Le Pen, when Le Pen seemed to argue in favor of banning the public wearing of Islamic garb, and while she seemed to be making an exception for the display of nativity scenes, and Melanchon basically seemed to fillet her on the inconsistency in that. I mean, how has he discussed? I mean, he seems to be promoting the traditional French ethic of secularism, at least in the public sphere, but that can have some dicey implications with respect to Islam, given that people who are Muslim tend to come under additional suspicion in certain respects, and then the climate in France obviously has shifted somewhat after the attacks of 2015, which were certainly, I would think, traumatic among certain segments of the population. So how has he sort of navigated that issue?
So one criticism he would get from parts of the left is that he's a traditional secularist in that sense, that he's a French Republican of the left wing variety, which means he sees things in terms of universals and is less likely to look at the specific, say, power relationships that come into play. I have to say most of the French left is secular and Republican. It follows the line, basically, that Melanchon argues it's a minority which doesn't. But then again, it's the same French left that has had difficulty connecting with ethnic minority communities and religious minority communities in France. One good example of how he deals with it, which people would criticize, but it gives you a sense of what he does. So one of the big scandals of recent years was the burkini debate, right, where there was these images of women being accosted on French beaches by the police for wearing burkinis, and it became a big public scandal. Melanchon talked about that as being a distraction. So while some parts of the left and some Muslim right groups would have been arguing that the left should have been out there defending the rights of people to wear what they want and so on, he said, no, what this is it's basically just a distraction. It's something that's being constructed as part of a culture war by people who don't have real Republican values. And then he went further by saying, well, look at who some of these people are who are making these scandals. So he says, Francois Hollande, when he sold the beaches in France, we sold some French public beaches to the Saudis. Did he turn around to the House of Saud and say, well, now you're not allowed to wear bikinis on the beach? No, he absolutely didn't. And this is a hypocrisy. The Le Figaro, one of the big newspapers, the centre-right newspaper in France, France was making a big deal of this at the time, and their proprietors are involved with selling arms to the Saudi regime. So he says, let's look at that hypocrisy and see, are these people really so concerned with the repression of women by reactionary ideologies? So at the same time, he has, I think, some parts of the left would argue his republicanism has blind spots about the specific attacks on Muslims. He tends to have a general view about separation of church and state and protection of civil liberties, which is not specific to the Muslim community. He is clearly, like, in this race, by far the most progressive on these questions, compared with the centre and centre right of the four candidates, at least, who are competitive. The centre and centre right, Macron and Fillon, are quite happy to follow the kind of arguments and debates created by Le Pen. Macron talks about massively increasing the number of police, having more securitization in France, increasing the military budget to deal with the problems of radical Islam, and so on. So even the centre candidate is willing to go along with the narrative Le Pen constructs, whereas Melanchon is trying to put a flag on the ground in the kind of French Republican terrain on it.
On a similar note, what is his program with respect to, like you mentioned, other candidates have proposed increased securitization and maybe even deployment of additional police. How does he specifically respond to the specter of terrorism? I mean, is that an issue that has gotten more attention than maybe it has in the past in light of the 2015 events? What tone does he strike on that in particular?
So on the domestic front, he hedges somewhat the bets, it has to be said, in terms of whether it's necessary to have increased powers for police. And so at one point, his group in the Parliament had supported the emergency laws introduced after the terrorist attacks, and then came to be quite critical of them. Really, the way he frames all of these things, though, in terms of the question of terrorism, is seeing it within the international context of what the effects of the war on terror have been. So he talks about himself as the candidate of peace, somebody who's going to pull out of NATO, who's going to stop interventions abroad, which have opened up spaces for radical Islamist forces, for instance, ISIS. He talks quite a lot about the need to support progressive movements in the Middle East, rather than be engaging in a kind of proxy wars, which the West has often done, which has facilitated the development in many cases of the very groups which now the West claims to be fighting. So an awful lot of his discourse around that is that he's going to be the candidate of peace, not just in terms of the Middle East and in terms of trying to stop the flow of huge proportions of politics in parts of the Middle East towards radical Islamist political forces, but also actually in terms of international conflicts, such as with Russia. He has a policy of having an independent foreign policy for France, something that would look more like what Charles de Gaulle had, where he didn't position himself totally in the camp of the US, but was willing to play a kind of mediating role back in the day with the Soviet Union. Melanchon argues that France is mistaken to follow blindly Western foreign policy in the way that most of the EU does, and that it should put the brakes on, argue more clearly for peace and negotiation, against foreign interventions, against the development further of the military capacity of Europe. And that's an argument actually which has quite a lot of basis here. I don't think it has majority support, but it has enough support to mean that the security question hasn't become a key Achilles heel for him.
Yeah, you mentioned NATO, and withdrawal, or at least very much hostility toward NATO, is something that has been emphasized in American coverage of Melanchon's platform for obvious reasons. And again, that is tied to Le Pen, who has also expressed hostility to NATO, and I think at one point said something along the lines of that, membership in NATO makes France a pawn of the United States, something to that effect. So that I think is something that's been
It's another.
emphasized here, and it's led to this criticism that this makes Melanchon and Le Pen somehow, the candidates of Russia, which
Yes,
if go
they
ahead.
make that another argument. So the press, it's mainly the international press. Actually, more so here, there's the concern about Mélenchon having relationships with Latin America. The international press have gone much harder, actually, on the Russia question, on this idea that the American and British press, I've seen it in mostly, that three of the leading French candidates are in the pocket of Putin. I have to say, I mean, these kind of arguments, Russia seems to become this bogeyman that can just be spread across any anti-establishment force with uncritical kind of belief by a lot of liberal opinion. The truth of it is there are different spectrums here of what people are saying. Marine Le Pen does have quite close relationships with Putin's government in Russia, and one of the reasons is that in certain areas they share a common program, which is to say strong nationalist, relatively identitarian politics, which aims at quite authoritarian domestic policies and with a kind of nationalist foreign policy. Francois Fillon comes from a more Gaullist tradition of the kind I just described Melanchon talking about from time to time, which is to say he doesn't believe France should just be hitched to the wagon of the US or to, in the European terms. He has made some mild criticisms about that, which are interpreted as being in the pocket of Putin. And Melanchon, really what he's saying is this, that he doesn't think moving towards conflict with Russia, increasing tensions, increasing the presence of NATO in Eastern Europe, creating situations, quite dangerous ones of the kind we saw in Syria recently with the Trump administration bombing an airfield at which there were only a couple of hours beforehand quite a lot of Russian soldiers. He's making the case that rather than do that, what France should be doing is having an independent foreign policy which tries to lower tensions between these countries rather than increase them. And so they're quite different things. There is definitely some shared project between the nationalist forces in Russia and in France on the right, with candidate of the left like Mélenchon. Really what the argument is we're going to realign. We're not just going to follow American foreign policy. And that is what won't be accepted. I mean, it's the same with his stuff about Latin America. When you hear this stuff about the Russians under the bed, when you hear this stuff about, the scare story about Latin America and so on, and the stuff about NATO, really what's being expressed is that in particularly the US and in Britain, it is not acceptable to break from Western geopolitical policy and its institutions, and anything that attempts to do so will be immediately aligned with all of the bogeymen that have been created to justify Western geopolitical policy, which includes Iran and so forth, which have also been mentioned in the French press. And another key point of distinction between them, Mélenchon foregrounds his critiques of things like what's happening in Chechnya at the moment with LGBT people and the repression. He has mentioned numerous times in his speeches the situation there, why France should be active in opposing it, and so on. And so you can see that his domestic policies really cannot be compared with the Putin government. What it is it's a question of geopolitical realignment.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned this dichotomy between international media's emphasis on this angle in contrast to the domestic French media's relative non-interest in this angle. I know Fillon was asked to comment on whether France is purportedly interfering or meddling in the election, and he kind of dismissed the prospect as absurd. And actually, the New York Times just had an article, I think just today, in which they are likening the so-called Russian active measures underway in France now to what allegedly occurred in the United States presidential election in 2016. So, that narrative has sort of become all-encompassing and applicable to a whole variety of geopolitical scenarios now, that it almost is kind of degenerating into absurdity. What do you think accounts for the relative disinterest of the French media in this angle? Is it just that it doesn't seem substantively correct, or what would be the explanation for it?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, but there is some interest in it, but it's not what the level is in the American or British press on the specific question of Russia. I think partly it's because with Melanchon, they've been more looking at trying to discredit his domestic policies. So the narrative about Latin America is about comparing his economic policies to Venezuela. That's what I believe the intention of that is, because I think they know quite well that those are the things in which Melanchon has real strength, that people actually do want to see redistribution from the wealthiest in society, high levels of taxation on the very rich. So Melanchon talks about for people earning above 400,000, their earnings over 400,000 being taxed at 90%. He talks about taking on tax evasion, closing tax loopholes for the super rich. He talks about imposing penalties for people who try to abscond from those taxes and tax exiles and so on. And they know that kind of stuff is very popular. So is the idea of increasing the minimum wage, cutting the working week. So is the idea of improving public services. And so rather than focus on the Russia angle so much, they've really been focusing on the Latin American one, on saying, well, look, if you do all this, you'll end up where Venezuela is. I think they found that a more potent argument. The other reason why I think some of this is being done in a particular way, to kind of attempt to group together Fillon, Le Pen, and Mélenchon. We talked a bit about this in Jacobin in an article about the other candidate who's the front runner, who's Emmanuel Macron. So this election is interesting for a lot of reasons. One of them is that both the centre-right and the centre-left, historically in France, have declined to such an extent that new candidates, so a candidate from a new force, Mélenchon on the left, a candidate, Marine Le Pen from the Front National on the right, from a party that doesn't traditionally compete for power, and a candidate in the centre, actually, who pulls people from both the centre right and the centre left in a new kind of post-political formation, one that talks about being neither right nor left, but in a way that kind of argues that there's no differences between them, that talks an awful lot about the discourse, kind of really pro-business discourse of innovation, of efficiency, and all that kind of stuff. This is Emmanuel Macron, and he is without question the darling of the French press. There is overwhelming media support for the candidacy of Emmanuel Macron. He's seen as an alternative to Le Pen and to Mélenchon, compared with, in some cases, Justin Trudeau. And Macron's campaign is one that is possible to frame as kind of consistent with neoliberal globalization. So it's somebody who talks about actually increasing a lot of that those processes of more power for global capital. It talks about having further integration under the EU, neoliberal EU of the European economies, and has a kind of culturally liberal and economically quite free market politics, which suit really, really well the establishment press here, similar in many ways to the kind of Hillary Clinton politics over in the US. And domestically, he talks about cutting 120,000 public sector workers. He was part of a government under Hollande in recent years, which took apart an awful lot of the labour laws, and is now talking about moving further in that direction, taking away things, further collective bargaining rights, and opening up for negotiation things that were guaranteed legally for workers. In many ways, it's kind of his vision of the economy, this highly flexible, innovative economy, sounds an awful lot like Uber and their narrative of kind of economics in the US. And by framing other candidates based on the foreign policy stuff, it's possible to, by proxy, improve the standing of Macron as the only one who's basically going to keep things the way they are, be very close to the US, be very pro-European Union. And I think that's part of what the game that's being played here.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the overall trend toward sort of this anti-politics stance that has roots in a variety of kind of nodes across the political spectrum, but what unifies them seemingly is this rejection of the kind of longstanding political structures. And it's interesting because, in the United States, Bernie Sanders had a similar message, but the only viable way for him to pursue power was to do so within the confines of the Democratic Party. Whereas it seems that in France, Melanchon can just kind of form this formation whose sole purpose is to get him elected. He doesn't need to, say, go court these party power brokers and do what was required in the U.S. to actually accumulate sufficient delegates to win a major party nomination. So can you just what's the structural difference there in France that is allowing this anti-politics style to actually be viable electorally as opposed maybe to the U.S.?
So one of the things is the different electoral system. So France has a long history of numerous different forces competing in presidential elections. There tends to be more alliances at the legislative, so for the parliament, but for the presidential position, it has a long tradition of lots of different competing forces, and it's relatively easy to get on the ballot. There are quite a lot of different social forces that can back different parties. It hasn't all been concentrated into 2 or 2.5, say even like the British system in Europe, where Jeremy Corbyn, as an example of a counterexample, somebody who's having difficulty with this kind of left-wing populist message, had to try to do it through the Labour Party. Largely, this is kind of predetermined by the electoral system. So if you have a first-past-the-post electoral system, which makes it difficult even for, say, for instance, a second round like you have in France, where people can come back around, and if they voted for another candidate in the first round, well, then they can give basically a second preference to whichever of the two candidates gets through to the second round. In Britain, it's all first past the post. If the ones who come top win the seat, and it has a similar system in that sense to the United States, which creates these two kind of oligarchical parties. In France, that wasn't the case, which does allow for a disintegration, a more kind of authentic disintegration of the political system. In the US, the disintegration is happening inside the parties with anti-establishment candidates like Trump winning on the right and Bernie Sanders competing on the left. Here, they don't need to go through those channels. You can have Emmanuel Macron setting himself up with a new centrist force. You can have Marine Le Pen coming in with a new party it's an old party, but with a newly competitive party on the right, and with France Insoumise, Rebellious France, the force of Melanchon on the left. So I think that is a very important difference related to the electoral system. I also think there's actually a history here of the left being a player in politics, the left of the centre left, so to speak, people who define themselves against capitalism. That allows, it's a much deeper sea to swim in for anti-establishment people on the left. There is an understanding that there was traditionally a very big communist party which was consistently governing with the centre left over long periods of time at local and a regional and even legislative level, which backed a centre-left government as recently as 1981, which had lots of strength in the trade unions. And so this idea of like an anti-capitalist candidate is not so completely outside of what is acceptable. And there are two effects of that. One is, I think, the novelty of Bernie Sanders benefited him to some degree insofar as because there wasn't an established radical left, he was able to move into spaces that otherwise would have been closed off with hostility. But the other side of that is there isn't as much of a strong base for building a candidacy to the left of the Democrats. Like now, for instance, he goes and tries to find one or two elected officials and struggles. He has to operate through the party machine to get people elected and is being constantly frustrated. I think when you have a much broader base on the radical left, Melanchon has been in politics in that position for a couple of decades. It gives you an ability to be more secure in building that kind of campaign.
I'm sort of curious just about the mechanics of covering the race, because in the U.S., there's this rush toward trying to gain access to the operatives who surround the candidate, and then you have a certain select few journalists who are afforded the high privilege of being able to travel along with the candidates on their planes or whatnot. Really, it just comes off as a farce. And those people actually were the least perceptive in actually trying to cover the race, because they generally weren't in touch with the actual voter sentiment on the ground. They were more kind of inhabiting these removed circles. So their analysis was generally poor. What is just operationally, how are people going about covering this race? Is it worth just attending these rallies and talking to people, sort of a traditional on the ground sort of reporting style, and what has your tack been?
I think in France there are like three big papers. There's Le Figaro, Le Monde, and Libération. Le Figaro is the centre right, Le Monde is the centre, and Libération is supposed to be the centre left. And all of those, actually, just looking at this weekend, talking about the Melanchon campaign. At the Saturday papers, I was tweeting about what they were writing, and all of them had as their lead stories negative pieces. Two of them were covering the question of Latin America and Melanchon turning France into Venezuela, and one of them, Le Figaro, which is dealing with a more classically centre-right kind of socially and economically upper class constituency. They were talking about his education reforms. So Melanchon is talking about taking money away from private schools, increasing the funding for public education. He's taking away some of the privileges which exist within the French system for the kind of education facilities that have traditionally been captured by the social elites, and they were framing this as an education war. And so, the press has been very hostile to him. It's true as well that the press is quite hostile to Marine Le Pen and to the radical right. It really is a press that reflects what was traditionally the political establishment. As I said, you have a centre left, a centre, and a centre right, but that space is crumbling. It's falling apart. The Parti Socialiste that François Hollande won the election with in 2012, well, it is now down around 7 or 8% in the polls. This is a historically low number. Hollande deciding not to stand this time was the first time a presidential candidate, so somebody who was the sitting president, had ever not stood. And then there were anti-establishment victories in both the centre-left and centre-right parties. So for Jacobin, as a magazine of the left, so we understand that being our role as being a representative of a particular set of opinion, we have tended in covering in Europe and covering the Melanchon campaign to try to look at things from that perspective and to be quite straight up with our audience of where we are. So what we're not doing is coming out and pretending that we are some kind of neutral force that is looking down upon society from above, then completely removed from politics. What we're saying is, no, actually, we come at this from a political perspective as socialists, and we will look at the candidates, both Hamon and Melanchon, who are on the left, and see what their programs are like. We will give what a socialist critique of Macron in the centre, Fillon on the centre right, and Le Pen would be. And I actually believe that is a more. I don't say that there's no space for people to come into it without those perspectives, but I think actually it's a more authentic way to cover politics these days. Like, I read about Marine Le Pen most often in outlets that represent pretty closely her political views, because I think I'm going to get something close to what will look like a Le Pen policy in government if I understand what people who are on the radical right are saying about it. I will read about Macron, who is a guy who worked for finance for years in the Financial Times or in the business press, and I think you usually get the most intelligent analysis of the candidates of the left in outlets that are basically aligned with the left. I mean, similar to yourselves with the Young Turks in the US, when Bernie Sanders was struggling to get any kind of coverage from the mainstream press, there was like pretty regular and consistent coverage of what Sanders was doing coming from anti-establishment media on the left. There's still a space, I have no doubt about it, for people to come in and try to be particularly investigative, objective journalists, and trying to uncover the dirty laundry in politics of all of the candidates, wherever they may come from. But I think the idea of this kind of neutral media, which has an establishment that all orients around a tiny spectrum of political opinion, which does not reflect the society, does not reflect what elections look like anymore. I think that's dead. I think that's going away. It's going away quite fast. You see it with Melanchon trying to circumvent the media with his big live rallies and his communication of his program live on YouTube. You see it with Le Pen doing the same and having a relationship with kind of radical right aligned media as well. So I think what's probably going to happen is we're going to see over time something that looks more like the diversity of politics now, represented with anti-establishment forces in the media developing, and that has begun already in France.
Yeah, and I think that's evident in the United States as well, for sure. It's interesting because one aspect of Melanchon that's been emphasized in the U.S. Is that he seems to be very, like you mentioned at the outset of this discussion, he's popular on the internet, or he seems to have a robust online following, and that was definitely what propelled Bernie Sanders as well, and was reflected by his overwhelming support among younger demographics. And I was just looking at some polling that I think was done by Le Monde, which showed Melanchon had something like 44% of voters aged 18 to 24.
Yep.
And, that I think is concomitant with this animus toward establishment media as sort of not being reflective of the true political diversity in the country. So, for example, you have mainline outlets which, as you identified, are definitely stridently pro-Macron, but would pose as these neutral arbiters of the political scene when everybody knows that they're actually politically aligned with Macron. But so it would be, I think, salutary if they would just drop the pretense and just kind of, campaign for him indirectly, or at least not pose as these objective chroniclers, which people tend to know that they're not. And reporting from rural France that I've seen, for example, from this woman, Angelique Christophis, is that there's a very high anti-media sentiment as well. And that was definitely on display in the U.S. It's helped propel Trump, and he sort of used that as a tactic even now governing, campaigning against the media. And unfortunately, a lot of what he says has some validity, given that the media is constantly failing in just its basic tasks. Do you see a lot of anti-media sentiment? Is that something that is kind of informing this wider disillusionment?
It's huge, actually. The sentiment against the media here is very, very strong. Obviously, it's most vocal among supporters of Mélenchon and Le Pen, but there's a much broader layer of hostility. There's, I think this can be seen as well in Mélenchon's consistent rise in the polls, despite the attacks. So the attacks have been pretty relentless now for the last couple of weeks. They've been going after him, obviously, on the foreign policy stuff, as I was saying, challenging him on the domestic policy as well, but with attacks that are really aimed at kind of scaring people. So about saying, if you were to vote for Mélenchon, well, then there would be a collapse of the French economy. If you were to vote for Mélenchon, well, then there would be, we wouldn't be able to get basic goods, and the public sector would stop being able to fund itself. If you were to vote for him, you would expect to see like a collapse of law and order. All these kind of narratives have been there, and despite it, he's still increased in the polls. He's still done extremely well. Is now polling around 20%. So I think that evidences the kind of lack of credibility that lots of parts of the French media do have, and it's a real problem for them. I think with in terms of kind of the popular opinion and the populist politics, the media is one of the key institutions that people feel a rejection of. They believe that the political elites, the economic elites, and the media elites are part of what is a similar kind of group, what Podemos, the anti-establishment party in Spain, would call La Casta, the kind of political class or the regime, that they are part of a kind of politics that has become divorced from the social constituencies it was once meant to represent. And there is a very deep feeling which allows, the combined candidacies of anti-establishment candidates, even in a country like France, which didn't have the austerity policies of Spain and Portugal and Greece, and Italy was still hit by the financial crisis, but not in the same way. You can now still get, a collapse of the political centre. And I think that's going to continue. On the question of how the media kind of will adapt and whether or not it will be able to, I think one of the big questions will be whether or not, and it's going to expose a lot of things internationally, whether or not the media begins to move with these currents. So we begin to see like the centre-left paper being more open to Melanchon, or whether the fact that there are many of these cases owned by people who have a political mission in owning the press, that these are not just run anymore as for-profit institutions, but often you've got major oligarchs who own these institutions. That are they going to remain loyal to the kind of centrist politicians that they've tended to support, even as their audience dwindles?
Right. So one of my least favorite aspects of political punditry is this constant rush to issue predictions. But I mean, do you have any intuitions about the trajectory of this at this point? I don't make any predictions that you might later regret, but how would you sort of characterize your instinct here at this point in terms of outcome?
Yeah, actually, I recognize I didn't quite answer the first part of your question last time as well, which I think is worth looking at, this question of young people, and I think it will feed into the answer at the end, which is, yes, what's happening at the moment is that there's been a big swing amongst young voters towards Melanchon. The polls are now showing him the highest. A month ago, the polls were showing Marine Le Pen with the highest vote among young people. The phenomenon of the radical right in France is really quite different to what it is elsewhere in Europe and in the United States. Older retirees tend to be quite hostile to the Front National because they associate them with a kind of unreconstructed fascist politics. Whereas younger people who here have been swayed by a kind of identitarian narrative about their place in the world as French people and so on, who, were influenced by events at the Bataclan, were influenced by a kind of culture war that was created in many ways around them, tended to be quite strong Le Pen supporters. But what the polls weren't showing when they were showing Le Pen winning amongst young people was that they were all expecting really low turnout. The reason why Melanchon is now doing well in the polls among young people and winning is that they've actually changed the metrics of the polls. They're now polling higher turnout among young people, because young people were not going to simply vote for the status quo. They were not going to even, with his bohemian kind of politics and social liberalism, they were not going to vote in big numbers for Macron, because the reality for so many young people in France is declining living standards, precarious work, lack of real clear future opportunities, difficulty affording housing, and so on. So they were not inclined to vote for the status quo. But now there is a candidate, anti-establishment candidate on the left, which is motivating people who wouldn't otherwise have voted to declare a support in the race and support Melanchon. And this, to me, is going to be the key determinant of what happens between here and Sunday, which is the first round of voting. If there is a low turnout, what you can expect to see is the two candidates with the highest core support, which is on the centre-right, François Fillon, and on the radical right, Marine Le Pen, doing very, very well. So actually, although the Front National has increased its share of the vote in French society and has gone up in the polls, it has yet in an election to massively increase the number of people who are voting for them. What was happening was the number of people participating in the elections was declining, and the Front National between 2012 and 2014, when they had a big success in the polls, actually only increased 400,000 people in the number who had voted for them. They went from early 6 million to 6.8 million. And this is in a country of 66 million. So what the Front National has is a very strong and highly motivated core vote. And the centre-right, which tend to be older Catholic voters for François Fillon and so on, they're the same. They're going to be pretty dependable in terms of turning out. If, however, the turnout is high, you're more likely to get people who are not part of anyone's core vote, people who would have been swing voters, people who would have not been aligned to any of the parties, more young people, more disenfranchised people, more working class people. And if that happens, we can expect to see Mélenchon do very well. And actually, the chances of Mélenchon and Macron being in the second round are higher, because Macron also has a kind of relatively small core support, which will depend on kind of liberal middle class people and whether or not they're going to turn out and vote in high numbers in this election after the disappointment of Hollande. And the vote for Mélenchon is really based on the disenfranchised and the young. So it's going to be a really interesting question to see, can in the final few days the work be done on those campaigns to increase turnout, which would quite likely result in, if it was a high turnout, quite likely result in Mélenchon in the second round. If I had to make a prediction, right now my prediction is that he wouldn't make it, and people will hate me for saying that. But I think that the reality is, at the moment in France, that the political system has disintegrated so much, and Mélenchon's rise is so recent that it will take more time to win people back over to the idea that politics can actually change their lives. And that he has done an incredible job going from 10% to 20% in the polls. But the difference between that and actually getting into the first round is quite significant, because on the ground, get out the vote operations are really important, because he has no support in the mainstream press, and because he's relying on voters who, you can tell, I mean, people who are interested in voting for Mélenchon find appeal in his messages, are some of the most disillusioned and disenfranchised, particularly the ones who flocked to him in the last period of time. And they tend to be the least reliable voters. And the reason for that is simple enough, because they're the people who've been most abandoned by the political system, and people who really don't see that acting politically can change their lives in the way that they would want. And so the real challenge for Mélenchon, if he's going to defy that prediction, is in the final few days to make people believe that voting for him and him winning will be the difference between a future that looks pretty bleak and a future where there's more democracy, more participation, rising living standards, and overall a better society in France.